What if your body became evidence in a secret experiment after you died without anyone asking? In the early Cold War, as mushroom clouds climbed into the sky and radioactive fallout drifted across oceans, U.S. officials feared an invisible threat more than the blast itself: isotopes that would settle into soil, enter milk, and build up inside human bones. Strontium-90, a fission byproduct, was the prime suspect. Because the body treats strontium like calcium, it lodges in teeth and the skeleton, quietly emitting radiation for years. To measure that danger, a covert program took shape. Its euphemistic name was Project Sunshine. Sunshine grew from earlier studies such as Project Gabriel, which warned that repeated thermonuclear tests could saturate the biosphere with SR-90. But Gabriel's models leaned on theory and animal data. Planners wanted human numbers: how much strontium actually accumulates in people living under real fallout. Sunshine was designed to answer that question by collecting human bones and tissues from many countries and age groups, then measuring the isotopes within. On paper, this looked like public health monitoring. In practice, secrecy warped the methods. Sunshine's organizers mapped out a quiet network: pathologists, coroners, hospitals, tissue banks, tasked with finding samples that could be shipped, labeled, and analyzed without public scrutiny. The most coveted samples were from infants and young children because their developing bones absorbed strontium most rapidly, and their milk-based diets were a key pathway. That scientific logic produced an ethical disaster. Families grieving stillbirths or infant deaths were rarely informed. Paperwork was vague or absent. The project harvested data and trust at the same time. Sunshine framed its mission as global safety. Better numbers would mean better policies. But from the start, one principle was sacrificed to serve another. The right to consent was treated as a variable that could be optimized away. That trade would haunt the program long after the Geiger counters were switched off. Sunshine's scope quickly widened beyond a handful of samples. Planners wanted a worldwide snapshot: bones from North America, Europe, Australia, Asia, complementary environmental samples from soil, grass, milk, and livestock, and time series data to watch how each nuclear test season changed the curve. Teams set up milk monitoring stations, tracked fallout in wheat and cattle, and built charts linking test dates to spikes in SR-90 found in daily life. But the most politically explosive material remained human remains. How did those bones move? Quietly. Doctors and mortuary workers were approached as collaborators in research. Some were told the aim was to study general health. Others were told almost nothing. In places where law required permission, the requests were broad and cryptic. In other places, authorities looked the other way. The program sometimes preferred baby and child specimens because they provided the most sensitive measure of strontium uptake. That preference created patterns that would later shock the public: missing teeth, missing long bones, tiny bodies altered between death and burial. The secrecy was not only to protect feelings. It also protected national security. Fallout data, timing, intensity, isotope ratios could reveal information about bomb yields and designs. Sunshine sponsors worried that open discussion would help adversaries. So the project lived behind bland names and quiet couriers, its shipments wrapped in medical jargon and nondescript crates. Within laboratories, technicians cleaned and ashed bones, reduced them to powder, extracted strontium, and ran counts in scintillation counters. Graphs emerged: regional differences, age differences, seasonal waves after each test series. For scientists, the patterns were elegant. For the public, had they known, the method would have been intolerable. Sunshine's data might have helped limit harm from bombs, but its own methods produced a different kind of harm: a breach of dignity for those whose bodies became involuntary instruments. By the mid-1950s, Sunshine's silent supply chain linked continents. In Britain, Australia, Canada, and the United States, pathologists contributed samples under vague agreements. In some British cases, stillborn infants had leg bones removed prior to burial without parental knowledge. In Australia, tissue banks quietly set aside specimens destined for overseas analysis. In North America, hospitals with busy maternity wards became steady sources for baby teeth and tiny bones. Each transfer was a small administrative act. Together they formed a global pipeline that converted private grief into data points. Most families never learned of the project. For them, the loss of a child was followed by paperwork, a funeral, and the long work of recovery. Sunshine inserted itself into that chain after the fact, turning the body into material without a conversation. The contrast with environmental monitoring is stark. Sampling milk or grass does not trespass on the intimate boundary between person and state. Sampling bones does. The difference is not just legal, it is moral. It is the difference between measuring a landscape and measuring someone's child. Inside the scientific community, opinions were mixed. Some researchers pressed to declassify aggregate fallout results to inform the public and guide policy. Others insisted secrecy was essential. A few questioned the ethics of covert human sampling even while accepting the importance of the measurements. But the machine rolled on, powered by budgets and the belief that the Cold War stakes outranked qualms. Institutional review as we understand it today, independent ethics boards, transparent consent forms, did not exist in a robust form. Sunshine operated in that vacuum. The numbers piled up. Charts showed risings or 90 in baby teeth and children's bones following test series, then modest declines during moratoria. Those curves would later support campaigns against atmospheric testing. Yet the way the data were obtained guaranteed that when the story came out, science would share the stage with betrayal. Project Sunshine was only one thread in a larger tapestry of Cold War radiation research that treated human beings as means to an end. In the Pacific, after the Castle Bravo detonation in 1954 unexpectedly blanketed nearby atolls with fallout, the U.S. launched Project 4.1 to study Marshall Islanders' exposure. Physicians documented burns, thyroid damage, and isotope uptake over years. Care and consent were inconsistent, and the line between treatment and experimentation blurred. Within the United States, earlier Manhattan Project and Atomic Energy Commission studies had exposed hospital patients, pregnant women, prisoners, and workers to various forms of radiation to map dose-response relationships. In some cases, radium or plutonium was introduced. In others, whole-body counters measured contamination in workers after accidents. Documentation was often partial. Consent, when present, was loosely informed. The ethical logic repeated across programs. The public needed protection. Science needed data. Individuals would bear the burden so that many could benefit. The calculus foregrounded urgency and buried autonomy. This environment normalized practices that would later be judged unacceptable. It also built infrastructure, tissue banks, dosimetry labs, and expert committees that could be mobilized quickly whenever a test produced unexpected fallout. Sunshine benefited from and reinforced that ecosystem. Each small exception, one bone sample here, a tooth there, was rationalized as necessary. None of those exceptions felt like a scandal inside the system that made them. Only when the public gained access to the whole picture did the pattern appear for what it was. A culture of convenience where consent should have been a boundary, not a formality. The irony is sharp. Programs intended to protect society from hidden radiation risks injected a different risk into the social fabric, the erosion of trust. Once citizens learned that authorities took what was most personal without asking, the next public health message meets suspicion before it meets ears. Decades later, investigative journalists, lawsuits, and congressional inquiries began to peel back secrecy. Declassification in the 1970s and 1980s exposed fragments, memoranda about bone seekers, procurement notes from tissue banks, inventories of specimens that listed ages too young to read their own names. Families who discovered their losses had been amplified by covert sampling demanded answers the files could not always provide. Many records were incomplete, scattered, or destroyed, a second injury layered on the first. In 1994, a formal reckoning began. The U.S. government created the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments to locate records, reconstruct events, and recommend redress. The committee's 1995 report criticized the absence of informed consent, the destruction or dispersal of files, and the weak oversight that allowed programs like Sunshine to operate in shadow. It urged apologies and compensation where evidence supported claims. President Clinton publicly apologized to victims of Cold War radiation experiments, acknowledging that a line had been crossed when citizens were used without their knowledge. Some families received settlements, many did not. The gaps in documentation, by design or neglect, made proof difficult. Yet the committee's work reshaped the landscape. It accelerated the spread of institutional review boards, clarified the meaning of informed consent in federal research, and reinforced the rule that human subjects deserve transparency, independent oversight, and the right to say no. Sunshine, long framed as a technical exercise, entered civic memory as a cautionary tale. The exposure also influenced policy. Atmospheric nuclear testing ended. Fallout data informed safety standards for food and milk. Environmental surveillance improved. But none of those outcomes erased the underlying lesson. Scientific success does not cancel ethical failure. When methods violate dignity, findings inherit the stain. It is possible to hold two truths at once. Sunshine produced data that improved understanding of fallout pathways and supported arguments to stop atmospheric tests. It also violated bedrock ethical norms by harvesting human remains without consent. Those truths coexist, and their tension is precisely the point. We do not need to deny scientific value to insist that the path taken was wrong. Instead, we can ask a harder question. What would an ethical version have looked like? Alternatives were available. Wider environmental monitoring could have provided trends without invading bodies. Voluntary tooth collection programs, like the later baby tooth surveys that mailed children's teeth for science with parental consent, could have substituted for covert sampling. Prospective cohort studies, openly explained, could have mapped isotopes in willing participants with careful medical follow-up. Each option requires patience and transparent partnership. Secrecy is quicker. Sunshine chose quickness. The program also illuminates how bureaucracies drift. Small exceptions break norms, and then the exceptions become the norms. Euphemisms accumulate. Procurement becomes collection. People become material. Grief becomes supply. Language softens the edges until they disappear, at least for those doing the work. Good intentions further dull the senses. Many Sunshine participants believed they were protecting the public. That may be true of motives. It is not a defense of methods. The lasting lesson reaches beyond radiation. Any field that touches human bodies, data, or minds must anchor itself to consent, accountability, and auditable records. If a method cannot survive a clear explanation to the people it affects, the method does not deserve to proceed. Sunshine failed that test. The rules we apply today in ethics review, data protection, and public reporting exist to keep future scientists from mistaking necessity for permission. Project Sunshine belongs to the past, but its questions live in the present. As genomics, biobanking, AI-driven health prediction, and ubiquitous sensors promise insights into our bodies and behaviors, we face a modern version of Sunshine's temptation. Collect first, explain later. The tools have changed, the moral geometry has not. Consent must be specific, informed, and reversible. Oversight must be independent and strong enough to say no. Records must be complete so that people can trace how their contributions, voluntary or not, were used. Anything less invites the same corrosion of trust that shadowed Sunshine's legacy. There is another parallel worth naming. Sunshine justified secrecy by pointing to an external threat, the rival superpower, and the fallout cloud. Today, institutions justify opacity by pointing to competition, intellectual property, or the speed of innovation. The vocabulary is different, the effect can be the same. When urgency becomes a solvent, it dissolves the boundaries that protect people. The antidote is not to deny urgency, but to design systems that handle it without sacrificing dignity. Publish protocols, enable community oversight, and treat consent as collaboration rather than a barrier. What remains, finally, are the stories. Charts and isotopes matter, so do families and names. The people whose bones were turned into numbers did not volunteer to become symbols. We honor them by refusing to repeat the logic that erased their voices. We honor the scientists among Sunshine's ranks by learning the lesson their work, however valuable, failed to heed. Knowledge without respect is a deficit, not a gain. This is the legacy of Project Sunshine and the human radiation experiments, a warning that methods matter as much as results, a call to build science that the public can trust, and a promise that the next time the world feels dangerous, we will not confuse speed with permission or secrecy with wisdom.